Hi, everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of Certified Forgotten. I am, as always, one half of your Matt hosts. I'm Matt Monagle. You know this. You've listened to the show. You know what the deal is. And I am joined by my friend, by my colleague, by the guy who makes me watch movies I don't want to watch, Matt Donato. How you doing, bud?
Good, but technically, I don't make you watch them. Our guests make you watch them.
Well, I'm talking about outside of this. A lot of times you make recommendations, and then I don't like those recommendations.
Well, like horror comedies more. I don't know what else to tell you. Get better taste.
Sorry, buddy. I'm sorry.
Go watch Sauna for the 17th time while you're listening to the Hagazusa soundtrack.
Correct. And now we can make some sort of an empty man joke there too. All right, so if this is your first time listening to the show, congratulations. You have found the best horror show in the podcast verse that talks about movies with 5 or fewer reviews on Rotten Tomatoes. As far as I know, we're the only one, so it's not exactly a high bar to cross, but hey, here we are. And every week, it's not just Matt and I, we bring on an excellent guest to talk about some of the best horror that you haven't seen. And this week is it's no exception. We got a guy here who knows his indie horror film as well as anybody and who is no stranger to the podcast scene. Matt Donato, can you do the introductions, please?
Well, yes, Mr. Monagle, we have a fantastic guest, as always. This is no exception. We have the co host of the Scarred for Life podcast and editor, chief, owner of Gaily Dreadful, Terry Menard.
Hello. How's it going?
Only took 3 tries. No one at home had to know that, but I'm telling you anyway.
You certainly did. You just put it all out there.
Terry, I want to say welcome to the podcast. This is a weird podcast for us because the service, let's just get this out of the way. The service that we normally use to record audio now does video. So we're all just sort of looking at each other when we've never looked at each other before. It's not unwelcome, but it's also a little uncommon. So we're going to be figuring out our new dynamic in what is now a video first audio podcast, which makes absolutely no sense. Which hopefully means that when you delight us with some awesome stories, Terry, we're going to laugh extra hard for you. How's that sound?
Oh, that sounds great. I wish I had known that this would be video though, because I would have wore like my crop top or something. But
No, it's okay. I'm going to spend this entire podcast checking out the entire shelf of board games you got in the back. That is where my heart lies.
there is a lot back there. But just ignore it because there's a lot of mess. I was not aware of the video beforehand.
For the people at home who cannot see, there are a lot of board games in the background of Terry's video.
Yes, I am an avid board game player.
So we're going to talk about that on a different podcast that we haven't created yet, but probably in the future. So Terry, let's talk about you, man. So this is the premise of the show. We like to talk to our guests about kind of how they got their early start in the horror genre, and as somebody who slices and dices horror from at least 4 different ways from your various endeavors, I'm really excited to hear what kind of stuff you're going to say about your own relationship to the genre. So let's start at the very beginning. What was the first horror movie? What was the first horror experience? What was the thing you remember that maybe scarred you for life, if I may?
Ah. Well, I'll say Monaco. I kind of thought we'd come on here and we just sort of take over because we both lived in Alaska.
Did I know that? Did I know that? Is that a thing I knew?
I'm not sure. Maybe on Twitter we talked about it at once, but yes, I lived in Alaska for about like the first 8-ish years of my life.
Oh no, this is just going to be a childhood therapy session. Did it suck for you too?
It did. It was very
Okay.
lonely.
Okay. All right. It wasn't just me then. Thank you.
No, it was very lonely. And I where did you lived in Juneau, right? Is that correct?
Correct. Yep. For about 20
Yeah.
years.
Wow. Yeah, I was a lot more south. We were about 20 miles outside of Anchorage in a town called Eagle River.
Okay. I know it.
Very
Yeah. Yeah.
small.
That is a cute part of the state, though. If you were ever to visit Alaska, probably that's the area I would tell people to go is the Eagle River area.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It really is. It's just not a there's a lot to do outside, but like if you're an introvert like me and you don't have a lot of friends, it can be a very lonely experience. So you end up watching a lot of movies,
Hmm.
which is what I did. My dad was a huge fan of like the Universal monster movies and some of those movies growing up between like the 30s and the 50s. So my childhood or an initial experience with horror was more of the fun side to me. It was like Dracula and Frankenstein, Creature from the Black Lagoon, as well as like the Abbott and Costello movies, particularly Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which was one of my favorites as a kid. And then there was that period, and then there was the period of when I was about 8 years old, and my family introduced me to Alien, and that movie wrecked me.
Say more. Say more, Terry. What do you have for me here?
Well, you know what, up until that point, movies with aliens were flying saucers. It was The Day the Earth Stood Still. It was that kind of thing where it was just like flying saucers and 50s cheese. And so I went into this film not knowing anything about it. And when the dinner scene happens, my face was basically like whiter than it could possibly be now and just terrified. And we stopped the movie and I didn't want to watch it ever again. And then that made me wanna watch it. Like, I remember watching the sequel and being okay with the sequel, and by the time I was okay with the sequel, then I went back and was like, "Okay, I can tackle this movie." And that was sort of my introduction to the not safe horror.
So how old were you when you finally like reclaimed Alien for yourself?
You know, that whole time was sort of like a haze, like, I'm so old now that I can't really remember, but I think it was
Sure.
somewhere between, like, 8 or 9 is when I eventually, like, revisited it after I'd watched Aliens, like, multiple times. It was just enamored with it. I was like, "Okay, I can go tackle the first one again."
That's still really young. Like eight or nine for Alien is still a really young viewing experience, especially if you're going back to try and like conquer your 6 or 7 year old fears.
Right, yeah. No, I it was my parents when I first started out, my parents were very lax on what I could watch. It was just they had a rule that originally they had a rule that, if there was nudity in it, I had to cover my eyes, which as a closeted gay kid, not seeing breasts is not a problem for me. But my parents, of course, didn't know that.
Right.
I didn't really know that at the time either.
Right.
Uh
That's the closeted. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so, like, for a while there, it was kind of carte blanche in some ways, like, if the VHS cover was too evocative, my parents would say no, but for a lot of movies, Nightmare on Elm Street was okay, some of the Friday the 13th were okay. So I just sort of, like, went through like, span of the '80s slashers, and then my parents started to really lean into the whole Reagan era and the whole like conservative feel, and all of a sudden they stopped letting me watch R-rated movies. And at that point, I found books, which were not being policed by my parents or the bookstore.
Yeah, that's so my wife works in publishing and I've mentioned this one of my favorite quotes of hers. Mentioned this in the podcast before, but she always says her parents let her read stuff she had no fucking business reading
Yep.
because like her parents were like these are books. How could this be books? And she was basically like it's fantasy smut. I'm reading fantasy smut, but my parents had no idea, but her parents had no idea because it's just, how dangerous can words on a page be? So I feel like a lot of people, like your parents, would be like, "You're not going to watch this movie, Hellraiser. This looks disgusting. You go ahead and read your Clive Barker book." And there was like that
Exactly.
disconnect for a lot of folks.
And that's what happened for me, where it was basically like I went from I was introduced to horror fiction in 5th grade by my English teacher, well, not English teacher, like my 5th grade teacher that was reading to us Goosebumps, because that had just come out, and like that was like the big thing. And so she read like the very first Goosebumps book to me and I fell in love with it. And then all of a sudden I went from Goosebumps to reading Stephen King, to reading Clive Barker, to reading like Kuntz, and eventually like American Psycho. So like I'm reading all of these books and like my and somewhere between, you know, 6th grade and into high school, and I'm reading these books that are just way more mature than I probably should have been reading at the time, but parents didn't know. So I didn't watch a lot of movies during that period because they were being policed. So horror fiction became my kind of gateway.
Well, let me ask about the community element because you said, lonely kid growing up in Alaska. Boy, do
Yeah.
I fucking relate to that. Um, did you find as you were kind of later in life exploring both horror fiction and horror films, is that when you started to feel like you were able to build a little community for yourself? We've had a lot of guests that have come on and said it was the fellow horror geeks that started to give them their first sense of belonging in high school or in college. Did you have a similar experience when you started to like connect to other horror fans?
Unfortunately, no.
Hmm.
I had the reverse. I was a very I think I was listening to your episode with Ari Drew, where he was talking about being kind of like guarded, and that was my experience too, especially being a closeted gay kid that didn't quite understand his own sexuality and didn't come out till he was 30. I spent a lot of my time very guarded and very distant from people, and my only experience at that time with like horror movies in the horror community was very much the sort of aggro straight dude. And it just I was like, I can't I can't be a part of this because then people will discover that I'm different. And so I stayed away for a very long time. And it wasn't until, for the horror side of things, it wasn't until like 2016 ish when I discovered podcasts and discovered that there were a bunch of people talking intelligently about horror and talking about horror in ways that weren't that kind of aggro kind of dude, that I realized that there's a whole huge community out here. So I didn't find the horror community until later in life. I had fallen more into the gaming side of things, which ended up turning into a cesspool eventually. But
Look, it's about ethics in games journalism, Terry.
oh,
Come on,
it
seriously.
absolutely
It
is.
it
It
always
is.
was about that. And it whatever. So you're telling me then kind of your connection, because there are, you recognize themes when you talk to a lot of people about their early days in horror. You know, there's definitely similar patterns of like, oh, I discovered something awful, or like I discovered internet forums and there was communities of folks. But you're saying that it was actually, you kind of skipped that like internet 1.0 period and jumped right into like the podcast generation, and that's kind of where you started to make a community for yourself. That's interesting.
Yeah, well, because it also happened that at the time when like the internet 1.0 was happening, I was more invested in the video game and video games. So like I had a live journal, and I was involved in a lot of live journal communities with around surrounding video games that were very like accepting and welcoming. And so that was sort of my entryway into thinking critically about entertainment, was that I started writing about video games in ways that I'd eventually write about movies. And that led to a writing job for Control Out Delete. It's a comic. I don't know if it's still going around anymore, but like back in like the early 2000s, Penny Arcade and Control Out Delete were like the two
Oh
big
yeah.
comics for video games.
Oh yeah.
And Control Alt Delete had Tim Buckley, the guy that draws those comics, he had decided he wanted to start like a video game criticism arm of his empire called CAD Media, Control Alt Delete Media, and he had requested people. I had applied for it and started writing for there, and that became sort of like my intro into writing about art outside of like I was an English major, so like I wrote about books and all that kind of stuff, but in terms of entertainment stuff, that was sort of my entryway.
So when did you find yourself pivoting back to horror? I mean, when did you decide that you had not only, you know, a voice but also something you wanted to say about the industry? And when did you really feel like you there were people out there that wanted to hear it?
Well, it was back in about like, well, it was kind of a slow journey. It was started in around 2016 when I started listening to a lot of podcasts, and I started realizing that there were queer presence, because by that time I was out. So I saw there's a lot of queer presence in podcasts, like Michael Verratti with his Dead for Filth, and there was a bunch of other smaller podcasts out there that I was like, oh, so maybe horror is welcoming. And at that point, I'd always wanted to write about it. I had kind of early in my 20s, I had dabbled with doing screenwriting and that kind of stuff. So I'd always had like an interest in it. I just didn't realize until about 2016, 17 that there was potentially a community there for me. And then that's when I got the idea, like, I want to start a website because I hate pitching. It, pitching, I admire everyone that likes to pitch because I absolutely hate it. And at that time, I had looked back at my work at in the video game stuff in the industry, that it was gone. Like it's you can go find it in the Wayback Machine, but I was like, I don't want to have the stuff that I write be controlled by someone else. And so I was like, maybe I'll start my own website. And so that's kind of how that all began. It started as a slow process in 2016 until launch of Gaily Dreadful in 2018.
To be fair, I don't think anyone likes pitching. I think it's an ugly byproduct of what we do. And by God, if I didn't have to pitch, that would be a totally different story. But yeah, I 100% that control is just something that, just the freedom. I think we've talked about it a few times in the podcast, and having that freedom to write what you want, especially, you know, in the sense that you just said, you found a way to not only express yourself but to reach other people because you realized that this community was so much bigger.
Yep.
It's something special when you can kind of carve that out. And I, you know, again, with the charity work you're able to do on the website, it just speaks to enough of the fact of the community that you have built.
Yeah, and that was sort of like a lark. Like everything I do, it seems like a lark. Creating the website, I was like, yeah, I'll do a website. I don't know how to build a website. Oh, there's a thing called Squarespace. I'll just sign up for that. And then it's like I had in 2019, I was like, I wonder if anyone would be interested in writing articles for, you know, Pride Month, and then that became a whole thing. And it's like everything around me just that I get involved with is just like, I wonder if that'll happen.
Talk to me about Scarred for Life, because like it's a frustratingly good idea. It's such a fucking good idea for a podcast, and I was so annoyed when I first heard about it because I was like, why the fuck didn't I think of that? It's one of those brilliant ideas to bring people in and talk about the horror films that scared them and left a lasting impression on them. So, like, how did you kind of grow that to the fact where now, like, if it kind of feels like if you're an independent filmmaker, if you're an independent horror filmmaker, one of the stops on the publicity cycle, man, it's got to be Scarred for Life. You're going to go and you're going to tell you and Mary Beth what the hell scared you as a kid. Like, it's that level of foundation for these filmmakers.
I have a hard time taking compliments, so but thank you.
And it's on video too, so you have to look at me looking at you as
I
I'm
know, this
complimenting
is
you.
so awkward.
It's wonderful.
I
Keep going.
I just want to say that as the co-host of Scar for Life, that this is incredibly uncomfortable for me because it's normally like I just get to like ask the questions and let people talk, and that is not the case now, and it's
Sorry, you're a
it's hard.
tastemaker and an influencer. Let's hear it, Terry.
Oh
Talk
my
about
god.
yourself.
That also started as a lark. There was someone with I don't remember who it was, but someone was tweeting about arachnophobia in around like July of 19, and I was like, "Oh god, that movie scarred me. That movie terrified me as a kid and actually changed the way that I interacted with the world." And I was like, that's a fun podcast idea." So I just sort of like retweeted it and was like, "Here's a podcast idea." And then Mary Beth was like, "Hey, I had talked about doing this by myself like 2 years ago and had a whole spreadsheet of stuff I wanted to do with it." And I was like, "Well, it seems like it's meant to be. Let's do it." And then everything from there has just sort of been like forced gumping my way through the process.
Not a bad place to be.
It's fun. It was a really good. It was really good during COVID with like keeping a schedule. I'm sure you guys know this of like
Mm.
I have this movie to prepare for, so it kept me like on this regular schedule of things that I had to do that just sort of helped create a community and then helped basically take my mind off of the shit show that was happening outside.
So we're about to jump into the talking about the movie portion, but I'm gonna ask, can I ask you a capital Q question that you made me
Oh.
think of when you were talking about your experience a little bit in the games journalism?
Mm.
Looking at the way that industry, those audiences and that fandom has kind of had to recognize and reckon with some of the more toxic elements of it, I can't help but feel like you sort of went out of the frying pan and into the fire with like film journalism and film criticism to kind of have the same catharsis or the same event. So I don't know. I'm curious. Do you have any insights from your time in game journalism about sort of where you see the future of broadly speaking, the film community or the horror community in particular, where you see that heading and what gives you, I don't know, hope or excitement that it is going to be the inclusive space that you really want it to be?
Well, I see the future of I see people that are starting to come up now through Twitter and through their writings, and it's a lot of people of that aren't typically accepted in video game journalism. Where the problem with video game journalism was is that everyone was very toxic with their communities, and everyone is very much like a we're team Xbox or we're team PlayStation or we are team bigotry,
Was that a
and
console
s-
that I missed? That was a bit on the nose.
it did really well for a couple of years where everyone kept saying that it wasn't what it was, and then it ended up fizzling. Yeah, no,
It's better than
I
the Dreamcast.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
oh, poor Dreamcast. So as I think that one of the things that we need to do is we need to make sure that we're protecting what we're talking about and not let these fringe groups take over conversations. And I see that happen a lot on Twitter where people are like elevating other voices. And unfortunately, I'm seeing it happen a lot from a lot of the big names in horror. And that's what needs to happen. It needs to be that we are creating an inclusive space so that people like me can feel welcome and not and realize that horror journalism is for everybody, that it's not just for a specific subset of people, which was my bias before coming into it. And I see we're doing that on a daily basis, and it's not perfect, and I do think that there is some areas that of not necessarily horror criticism but film where it's like I if you ask me, I would never want to review a DC film or a Marvel film because that reminds me too much of the sort of like boxing camps in horror or in video game journalism. So there are areas about that I just sort of steer clear of. But I think horror seems to be in a relatively decent place. We just need to protect that.
Yeah, and I feel like We are in a way. I feel like things have changed so much, even thinking back to, man, what I used to read on some of these websites and how they used to interact, and how when I was growing up and when I would read Joe Blow, when I would read Dread
Mm,
Central, it read a lot differently than it even
mm-hmm.
reads right now. I think there are sites that did stay in that mindset of, as you said before, like horror journalism and horror writing was a lot of aggro, straight dude. I don't even want to call it humor. I don't know what it was. It was just that personality. And it is so off-putting to even look back on and to think that like that was all it was for such a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And the stuff that we can now read on like Bloody Disgusting, which wasn't perfect for a while ago, like don't get me wrong, that was just like all the others, but the strides they've taken and the strides that other sites have taken, and what Fango is doing so much, and what all these sites are trying to do, it makes me very hopeful from where, again, I was reading a decade ago. And a decade is a long time, but also it's not really. So like
No.
it didn't have to change the way it did, and it didn't have to change in the sense that even going to festivals, and that was the way that I kind of broke into it, and I didn't feel like I was really part of a horror community for a long time because I didn't get into horror until later. I was not viewed
Mm-hmm.
as someone who was knowledgeable. I was not viewed as someone who knew what they were talking about, just because I didn't have that quote unquote cred. I didn't dress like everyone else. I
Right.
didn't do that kind of stuff. So going to festivals and, like you said, finding those people that didn't give a shit about that, and all of a sudden, like bumping into Trace and becoming friends with Trace and bumping into all these people and kind of like doing it that way, that was, yeah, it felt really good at that point. And I think we have come a long way from, again, the hottie of the week posts on Arrow in the Head and Joe Blow, but I think I still see them there sometimes.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with it. Like
It's not.
I've run a post on my site from someone that was breaking down the hottest men in Friday the 13th series. Like it's human nature. It's what we're going to talk about, but we need to have room for other voices. And that was the thing that I realized listening to podcasts originally, was that, oh, there are other voices, and I think that we need to make sure that we are creating space for those other voices, so that we become a more diverse and more friendly group of people. That I mean, I've seen strides in the last even 2 years that I've been doing this, and I think we are in an upward trajectory, personally.
Yeah, and I think that there's definitely a sense that I don't know, it's a fine line to walk between being passionate about something, being invested in something, and taking ownership over something. And I think that last part is usually where things go a little bit awry, right?
Mm,
Like it's fine for you to be a fan of horror. It's fine for you to be a fan of DC or Marvel. But when you start to say things like that's not the way that that's not my vision for this. Like, they cast the wrong person, they gender swapped, or, they cast an actor of color in a role that I didn't want. Once you stop participating in the thing that exists and sort of defending the concept of it that exists in your head, that's where things get ugly. And I think, generally speaking, I think the horror community is really good about not crossing into that line of ownership. And there's obviously a lot of horror fans that are very rooted in the type of horror that they want to see. But specifically, thinking about the horror Twitter community, I think they do a good job of balancing the fact that, like, they care deeply, deeply about this thing, but they're not, their personal identity is not so invested in it that if somebody does something different than they would do,
right.
or if they make a change, that's not a personal attack on them. That isn't, they don't read that as somebody saying, like, everything that got you to this point, your passions are wrong. They're just like, oh, cool, like there's a new thing out there that I wouldn't have expected or done, and now I get to engage with it in a different way.
I think there's a willingness to learn, and every fandom, every sector is going to have its underbelly.
Except for Star Wars. Star Wars
Exactly.
fandom is perfect. It's fine.
Oh
Keep
Right, of
going there.
yeah.
course. That's the best. Don't worry about it. I mean, like the DC fandom, it's like I'll live stream with Perry Nemiroff sometimes on Fridays, and if we have a DC topic, the live chat is just, we don't even have to say anything about it. People just jump in and they just start attacking you for no reason, just because they
Hmm.
think you're going to say something negative about it.
Mhm.
And
Or you're going to say something positive about it.
right, either way, positive or negative, you're screwed no matter what. It's just you
Uh-huh.
mention Zack Snyder's name and you have just fucked up your entire live stream for the entire night, and it just doesn't make sense. But like, I do feel a little bit where the engagement I've had with people in the horror community who may say the wrong thing at first, and again, this is not all, there are still hurdles, but the engagements that I have had have been encouraging in the sense that I wrote about the Friday the 13th remake, and I said it was better than the first three movies. That's my opinion. That's just where I stand on it. And some guy is like, "Oh, well, so obviously you're not a Friday the 13th fan." And I'm like, "No, why do you draw that connection?" "Well, because you don't like that. This is your opinion, so obviously you can't like it as much as other people." And I'm like, "But maybe that's because of all these reasons." And if you read what I wrote, and like through doing that, he's like, "Oh, I probably phrased this comment very wrong." And I'm like, "Yes, you did." And it's like I was able to get to a point with that person where at least it was like, why didn't you just say, "Oh, you view this in a different way than me. We appreciate this franchise in a very different way." And like getting there was not fun. I didn't have to do that. But at the same respect, like I just, there was a willingness there at least to be like, "Oh, I fucked that up."
Yeah, I do think that there is that sense of ownership of those 80s slashers between Halloween or, Child's Play or Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street. And that is the closest that I've seen, or and then in the 90s Scream. Those are the closest I've seen to like the sort of fandom kind of toxicity that I've seen in DC or Marvel. But that is, and I think that's because we're a lot of people that grew up on those. And so a lot of people feel like they have ownership, like this is the best series or this. And so when you bring up a point like the Friday the 13th remake, which I agree, it's better than the first three films. Uh, as someone that grew up watching those films, I also agree with that. But you have people taking ownership of it, and I think that is where we start to see some of the more dangerous is kind of maybe an over exaggeration, but some of more the kind of toxic communities that we can see form, unfortunately. But I don't think we see that anymore.
I was gonna say, I think the last thing I'll say to that is I think horror as a medium does the best job of not pandering and teaching audiences, and I think that's the big difference. And I think that's the last point I'll try to make, is the sense that a lot of other fandoms like to just make sure the fandom is happy and they're getting their dollars, and
Mm-hmm.
that's totally fine. And again, don't get me wrong, your tentpole horror films are still going to play to the masses, and they're still going to do that kind of fan servicing that they need to. And if it's a haunted house film, we're going to get the haunted house tropes. It's fine like that. But we do see a lot of progressive tendencies as horror evolves with our times, and as horror evolves generation by generation, it is forcing people that want to keep up with horror and want to keep being a horror fan to view those things. I mean, again, even me just growing up in a small suburban town where everyone looks like me, everyone dresses like me, like that was my Jersey hometown upbringing. And the things that I could learn from watching horror movies as recently as His House, like just even
Mm.
that's one, just pulling one out of the air. La Llorona. We talk about history and horror all the time. That, Monocle and I kind of, the one thing we agree on, it's one of the best intersections you can have when history and horror.
The one thing we agree on. We agree
One
on
of
more than
the one things.
Okay, all right, fair. All right, fair.
One of the things we agree on. But today it's like I was able to learn so much from these, and able to learn so many things that like horror was my passport in a way. And I just don't think other genres, other areas want to do that. I feel like horror, as it is more accepting, and we get that as filmmakers, as we get that as coverage, as journalists, it forces people to either keep up or kind of fall off. And if you want to fall off, great, go stay with your 80s and just talk about them. But those people go to the wayside, where everyone that does want to keep moving forward, that's who we get to keep interacting with.
Just don't read the comments.
Never. I still do, but don't.
Well, we've been talking a bit about franchises, and that seems like a very natural segue into today's film, which is a franchise unto itself. So when we come back, we're going to be talking about Ju-on. We're going to get our grudge on, and we're going to go all the way back to the golden days, the early days of J-horror, Japanese horror, the year 2000. So stick with us. We'll be back in a sec. Well, hello everyone listening to this episode. Thank you for joining us for a very exciting conversation about all things J-horror. We always say at this point in the show that we couldn't do this without the support of our Patreon subscribers, and it's because it's true. It's just because it's a fucking fact. And to prove it, we want to go ahead and do a couple of reads from some of our very loyal followers. They're going to make us say some things that we don't want to say, and that's just part and parcel of having an awesome community like this. So, Donato, why don't you go and do yours first?
Sigh. Okay, if I have to. This is brought to you by our Patreon subscriber, Steph. And she recently learned that I have just watched Josie and the Pussycats for the first time, and she got very excited. And she wanted me to read some lyrics, not from a Josie and the Pussycat song, but from, well, okay, I'm just gonna do it. We're just gonna get there, and we're just gonna get through this, and then, yeah. Lying on your bed, staring up at the moon. You got me crazy, but I'll love you soon. I'm your backdoor lover, coming from behind, with the lights down low. Backdoor lover, just you and me. No one has to know. Backdoor lover, let me meet you there at your secret spot. I'll show you will love more than hot. So that was Backdoor Lover by De Jour, which means friendship, that I have just found out on top of a lot of other things. But yeah, that's what Steph made me do.
Would you describe yourself as a backdoor lover, Matthew?
It depends if it's a Friday or a Saturday.
Okay. That is actually a totally fair answer. I have no jokes about that. Totally makes sense in my book.
That's what I got. So I hope yours is less whatever that was.
No, mine is pretty bad too. So my wife, the wonderful, talented, compassionate Andrea Monagle, has given me the following thing to read, and I'll provide a little bit of context after it's over. Another airing of marriage grievances. Peanut butter sandwiches should be made by spreading an even layer of peanut butter on a slice of bread. My method of making a peanut butter sandwich, knifing a hunk of peanut butter onto the bread with no spreading, and then mashing the other slice of bread on top to move it around, is inferior and lazy, and I renounce my ways. So, a little context for you. Andrea and I have like a little workout routine that we do every week with Peloton and stuff, and we set monthly goals. Whoever has the most minutes punishes the other person by setting a something they have to do in that month. And because Andrea got more minutes in February, my punishment for March is that I have to spread evenly spread peanut butter across all of my peanut butter sandwiches, which means, and you guessed it, I'm making no peanut butter sandwiches in the month of March.
You're a psychopath. You are legitimately a psychopath. Only a fucking lunatic would put peanut butter on bread and smash it into place. No, you use a knife, even layers. You are so incorrect.
No, because I don't do smooth peanut butter. I do chunky peanut butter. So you just mash it and then squish it, and then it all kind of fills the space that they want.
What kind of bread are you using? Are you white bread? If you're just mushing that together, it's just becoming like a blob. I don't understand this.
You eat the non-peanut butter edges, and then you have basically what is like a one of those Crustables that is just like a pocket of concentrated peanut butter meat. And when I die, it'll be because I had a wad of peanut butter in my non-spread sandwich that I choked to death on.
That's not a sandwich. That's not even a sandwich. Sandwich even layers. What you are doing is literally just mashing peanut butter and bread together into this weird blob combination that does not make sense in any right. You're never allowed in my kitchen, near my kitchen, or near any of my sandwiches.
At the end of the day, we're all just trying to be or not be who we were when we were 8 years old. And that is who I will be forever. I was 8 years old. I made sandwiches that way, and I never outgrew it. So there it is, folks. I really hope you feel like you got your money's worth, patrons. Thank you for supporting the podcast and the website. I will never change the way that I make peanut butter sandwiches. I'd rather die. That's all I got. All right, welcome back. So today we're talking about on the show Ju-on the Curse. Now let's talk a little bit of brief history about Ju-on the Curse, because if you've heard of Ju-on, you're probably thinking, wait, are they reviewing? They were doing the one that came out in 2003, right? Like Ju-on the Grudge, or they're talking about The Grudge, which is the Sarah Michelle Gellar one that came out in 2004. Wasn't there a TV show? Didn't the girl from The Grudge fight the girl from The Ring? So let's unpack for just a real brief second here. So, Ju-on the Curse is the original. It's the first feature film in the Grudge franchise. It is directed by Takashi Shimizu. He got his start as a short filmmaker. He was working underneath his mentor, Kiyoshi Kurosawa, who you might know from films like Pulse and Dark Water. He got the opportunity to direct a direct-to-video horror film using some of the ideas that he'd played around in a shorts anthology that he'd helped prepare some scripts for. That ultimately became Ju-on the Curse. He played with elements in Ju-on the Curse we're going to talk about in a bit more detail that were specific to Japanese horror, that were kind of part and parcel from the rising wave of ghost stories in Japanese media. He also played with some cultural and traditional stuff. There's a dance form called Buto, which kind of combines experimental theater with expressionistic movement. It was a style of dance and performance that came up in the years following World War II and kind of rooted itself both in post-war tragedy and also post-atomic bomb tragedy as well. And from there, things just kind of, pardon the phrasing, blew up. Shimizu became a director who directed multiple versions of the film. He directed a sequel to Ju-on the Curse. Then he remade Ju-on. Then he directed another sequel to that film, and then directed an American version of the original film, the one that you're thinking of starring Sarah Michelle Gellar. In that process, and in the I think 8+ additional films and video games and books and other media that came out, there is a core set of beliefs. There's kind of a core set of mythology that developed over time for Ju-on and all of the sequels and remakes that came out. But it all begins here. It all starts right here with Ju-on the Curse. All of his original ideas, all of those original thematic elements that you know and love as part of the Grudge franchise started here. So we're going to talk about Ju-on the Curse. Forget all that other shit. We're going back to the beginning. And our first question of the day is for you, Terry, and that is, why this movie? You know our rules, 5 or fewer reviews on Rotten Tomatoes. So what made you think this is the one I want to talk about?
Well, partly because I do think this is kind of an anomaly for your films, in that if you were to go look up Jew on the Curse on Rotten Tomatoes, you would find that it actually has 14 reviews. But of those 14 reviews, I think all of them are actually about Jew on the Grudge, which was the movie that came out in 2002, 2003, and was released in the theaters in Japan and is the basis for the American remake. And so that Ju-on the Curse was not available outside of Japan for the longest time, unless you were like a young 20 something kid like me and decided to go look for it online, we'll just say.
I saw the
And
finger quotes and I heard the finger quotes. I'm just saying.
giving you a double dose of finger quotes, because I I don't have the same reaction to American remakes that a lot of film people do, because when I was in my 20s and I first saw The Ring and first saw The Grudge, it opened up a new avenue for me, a new place that I never knew existed. I didn't realize, I was dumb. I didn't realize that people outside of Hollywood made films. And so when I saw this and then I realized that these are based on Japanese films, I was like, holy shit, there's this whole other country of movies I can go pull from. And it sent me down a bunch of rabbit holes on finding J horror movies, and some of them was really difficult because, of course, the subtitle issue. But I remember stumbling upon Jew on the Curse after seeing The Grudge in theaters, and being really confused, because while there are a lot of similarities to it, and there's things that you can obviously see that have influenced both the Ju-on the Grudge release in Japan, but also the Grudge in United States. There's also a whole darker storyline that's happening underneath, and some of the sequences of it, and it's not as jump scare heavy as some of the later iterations. It's more about creating this mood, and I think that a lot of people. I think because if you look at Rotten Tomatoes and you see that there are basically no reviews for this movie that are actual reviews for this movie, I think this film in a lot of ways has been forgotten by mainstream uh, moviegoers, because they think of Ju-on the Grudge when they think of this franchise.
Yeah, and I can say, right, I can confirm basically what you just said, because I was really not that aware of it. That's me speaking relatively recently and saying I knew Ju-on. Yeah, I knew the quote unquote original, we'll say, and I knew the remake because the remake led me to that, and I very
Mhm.
much had the same appreciation of remakes that you have. To the point where I have a column at Play Disgusting, because I want to show appreciation to these remakes. There's a reason why I was able to find international cinema. And I can say that largely started with watching remakes that I didn't even know were remakes and realizing it, just as
Yep.
you said, Terry. So I think there is such a place to appreciate where those films came from while still appreciating the remake themselves. And Jew on the Curse is, to borrow your word again, an anomaly in the sense that it is the first iteration of a story that has been told so many times now, and a single director, given the opportunity to refine that story and tell it in different ways and given different budgets to do it. I mean, that just doesn't happen. Like, usually someone makes that little story, they'll sell the rights, it'll get taken by somebody else, a different director takes it over, and that original filmmaker never really gets to do anything more than have a credit now. Where this guy just did them all. He literally did everything. Like, he did the original, he did the Japanese remake, he did the remake in America. Like, this guy got to see his baby, and I say that now knowing how that's going to play into Jew on the Curse, but he got to see his baby and nurture it and just bring it into the world in so many different ways. I think that is so unique in this storyline alone, and it's why you have to appreciate the very first hack at it. You know, you have to appreciate where this all started, and it's kind of like seeing an early James Wan film where, for me, like, you watch Dead Silence and you can see where things are going to come into play later in Insidious, later in The Conjuring. Like, that was him playing with his ideas. And don't get me wrong, that was James Wan playing with his ideas in a Hollywood studio system with a big budget. Jew on the Curse is a director playing with ideas with barely any budget, and as you just said, creating a nasty mood, because that's what J horror did. J horror didn't have to do as many jump scares as American horror, because that's what American horror like to do. They just rely on the jump scares, where this J horror, you look at basically any of the films that are compared to their American remakes, and it is just so atmospheric and moody, and you're still going to get terrified, but it's not because something jumps at you and it's really quick. It's because that strangly haired demon of sorts is staring at the character dead in its face, and it just sits there, and it just, the dread is just palpable. So to see where it started, yes, it's the low budget version. Yes, it's everything that maybe some people will only want to see the American remake or the remake itself in Japan. But this, for me, it's a bit of history.
Yeah, you kind of talked a little bit about the way that the director is able to iterate on his movies throughout the entire history of this franchise. And what I find is so fascinating is that really this started as a kernel of an idea that he made two short films in 1998 for a TV anthology that were, one of them is called Katasumi and one is a
How,
bunch of fours. I think there's
how
10
many
of them.
fours? Okay, how many
I
fours
think it's
exactly,
10.
Terry? Okay,
I
okay,
think it's
just
10.
checking, just making sure.
Because the number four is synonymous with death in, I guess, in the Japanese language. And so that was like those were the two short films that he created, and those two short films tell a story that is cut out of, eventually, when he goes to create Jew on the Curse. They fit into that story with different actors, but they fit into that story of missing threads. And so he took those kernels of these two little mini scares that involve a little kid that meows and a creepy woman that bends her body in weird ways, and then iterated that to make Jew on the Curse, which he made that, and then the sequel, which follows directly. Like, it actually uses 39 minutes of the first Curse movie and then kind of does its own story retelling of it. And then he reiterates that again with the theatrical release. So we're seeing a director that is playing with these ideas, and it all really started with this film, and such an interesting low budget. Like, it was a release to I think it's called V Cinema. It was a straight to video release, so it had a very small budget, but directors were able to play a little bit more and not have as many producers weighing in on the story. And so he was able to go a lot darker than when he went with Jew on the Grudge. Gosh, it's hard to keep the names the
Mhm.
names separate. When he went to do Jew on the Grudge, it kind of turned him almost into a jump scare-a-thon in a way.
It's interesting because I'll fully fess up that I have now seen two films in this franchise. I've seen The Grudge, the American remake that he remade, and now I've seen Jew on the Curse. So it's sort of interesting to go and see the highest concept, biggest budget, like
Mm,
as many resources as you can version of the story he was trying to tell, and go back to the beginning and find that there actually is not as much of a gap there as you would think. Like, setting aside the fact that he's the one that goes back and direct, which is done out of said, that never happens. You know, the experience of watching The Grudge, I watched it for the first time, I think, 2 months ago, because my wife went on a really big horror binge, and I was like, I'm not going to fuck with it. Whatever you want, The Grudge, let's do it. I don't care. Like, whatever you want to watch. So we watched that. And then now sitting down and watching this, I was like, oh, like these fit together so nicely. Like, yeah,
mhm.
like one was made for whatever and the other was made for however many millions it was. But there's the experience of watching them isn't really that different. You're sort of like, I see what you're doing. Like, it's effective. It works. The performances are worse probably because you are dealing with, like, less established actors and Jew on the Curse. But the ideas behind it the way that the scares are set up and the way that they kind of manipulate the environment. This is a daytime horror film. It's good. It all works, and I was expecting the thing that you see. And Donato, you sort of talked about this when you were talking about James Wan. I was expecting to watch this and be like, oh, I see the pieces, but the hole wasn't there. I kind of saw the hole with this too. Ju-On the Curse kind of just works as a movie, man.
I agree. I do think watching it, because I watched it back in the early 2000s, and then it'd been a few years, and I sometimes go revisit it, or I'll find it if I can locate it, because it's not readily available here right now. I mean, it's streaming on YouTube. Someone luckily put it up there, but it's not as readily available in the US right now as it might have been a couple years ago. But it's something that that pulls me back in, is that there's something about the way it's presented that it doesn't rely on jump scares. Everything is a little bit more subtle, and a lot of it had to do with the budget. So it's not as technically well made as the theatrical release that he did, both in the US and in Japan. But you can see the bones of the story here. And what I really liked is the way that it allows itself to go really dark. Because what the scene that always gets me every single time is there's a character who, he's married, his wife is pregnant, and he has been through the entire movie sitting with the kid who it turns out is dead. And at one point towards the end, he gets a phone call from the boy's father. And this is the story that we see play out in all the grudges, where the man kills his wife, kills his son and the cat, and then kills himself in the other movies, is basically how it's portrayed. No, Kayako ends up killing him or whatever. But here we
I'd like to
have,
point out real quick, just to interrupt you for just a second. If cats have 9 lives, that cat did not survive the Grudge franchise. I'm just saying there are at least 12 of these movies.
there's
That cat did
13.
13 movies and multiple TV shows. That cat did not get out okay.
It did not get out okay. Somewhere around that time, it really lost every single one of its lives. But there's a scene where the teacher, who has spent, again, most of the his airtime, because again the story is told non-linearly, which again I really like. He gets phone call from the father, who has gone to his house and has killed his wife and cut out their baby. And he, excuse me, calls him on the phone to say, you have a baby and it's a girl. There's a shot of him in the phone booth. The phone booth is all bloody, and he's holding this bloody remains of this fetus that he cut out of the wife. And it's like, it's dark. It is dark and upsetting in a way that you don't traditionally see the rest of the Grudge movies go in.
Donato looks very excited.
Well,
right
then
now.
he like bashes it. He like starts
He
bashing it
bashes
against
it.
the phone booth. He's in a bloody phone booth and he's bashing the aborted fetus, and then like he chucks it in the garbage as he's running away. Like, and that's when you get the garbage bag scare. But yeah, no, I was not prepared for
No.
the lowest budget version of this to be the darkest. And I mean, that's even taking into consideration the most recent remake that Nicolas Pesce did, and the fact that like that Grudge was pretty dark. There were some dark elements in that, but still, Ju-On the Curse to me is it's the darkest iteration that this story has ever been. In the daylight of all places, like it plays that daytime horror the entire time. You still do get those phenomenal closet scares. You get the throat noises, and between Kayako and Toshio, you have the two villains in this, and there's no lacking makeup design. There's no lacking anything. When you see the full glimpse of these ghosts, these demons, they look like we've seen them over and over again. And it, don't get me wrong, it is a grainy quality. If you're watching the YouTube rip, I'm sure when it was on Shudder, these other places that had it, it was the same quality. That is where you can really tell. But outside of that, the architecture of the house looks exactly like it's been in all the other
Mhm.
films. The staircase scare, it's still there. It is still invasive and like in your face. And it's hard to escape that kind of just the sensation that it just keeps getting more vile and more evil and deadlier. And as the curse, the grudge continues to grow and it ensnares these people throughout, I actually liked the anthology format a lot because it was that exactly. It was an anthology. It was these bite-sized stories in the Grudge universe that were told very succinctly. The movie flew by for me. It's not hard to follow at all. It doesn't find itself either over-explaining or under-explaining, either way, given the anthology format. And I just really dig the non-linear. I had a lot of fun with that kind of vibe in this film, and I had a lot of fun with the way that it just didn't play like a normal haunted house film. It's like, nah, here's the house, here's the Grudge. We're just gonna have some fun around it. Here's some characters, and that's horror, baby.
Yeah.
I'm I think one of the things that impressed me the most about it is the fact that it brought haunted houses into the current millennium. You know, because especially if you watch a lot of American haunted houses, it's all the Amityville horror, right? Like it's this house that's clearly been around for a century, and new people move in and they're like, "This house is old, but we'll make it ours," and then shit happens, right? And I think the thing that was so impressive about watching this film was the way that they made these very antiseptic modern spaces. Like these are condominiums, right? These are or
Mhm.
apartment buildings. These are not spaces that were designed to be distinct and to give you sort of like crannies to hide in, right? There are no on paper elements of this house that feel unique to that building or that particular family. It's just like cookie cutter copy paste.
Yep.
And yet they were still able to turn this very modern antiseptic space into something that's genuinely creepy. And even when they're using the same space over multiple iterations of the people that lived there, those little personal touches that people, the way that they arrange their home, the way they use
Mm.
furniture and the way they set up bedrooms, that morphs the space in a way that's really interesting, and it makes it kind of creepy. And it's a really surprising amount of depth from something that is supposed to be and intentionally supposed to be not deep at all. And that makes it that's the thing. I think the scares, the crazy abortion stuff, I can't say that I saw it coming, but like I was like, okay, like this feel like I this makes sense. If somebody's on his game, he can do this. It was the way that they turned this apartment complex into uniquely terrifying building, like a haunted house. I was like, I did not think you were going to be able to make this place scary, and you kind of did. You really did.
Yeah, and like you both have said, they did it during the day because a lot of the film takes place in bright areas where there's no, it's not a gothic story. There's not a lot of areas where there's shadows. There's not places where things can hide. It's a lot of brightness, and it's the scenes where it contrasts this brightness with a lot of dark stuff. Where there's a scene where this one of the kind of tutors of this family in one of the sets walks out is in this bright room. She keeps hearing this cat meow, and she walks out into the hall, and all of a sudden they're playing with it and it's now dark, and the hallway is very moody, it's very dark. And so it's that contrast of this brightness and then walking into this thing where it's like, oh, there's something wrong here. And then she flees back into the brightness, and that's where she ends up getting herself killed. But then there's also kind of taking that traditional haunted house story and turning it on its head. This is another case that's happened throughout the Grudge series where you're not just safe in this house because there's one anthology set piece that's set at a school where the girl is being haunted by the ghost of Toshio that's pitter patting around in this dark teacher's room. And so it's this idea that you're not safe. If you leave the house, you're still not safe. That ghost is going to follow you because you have entered this area of negativity briefly.
Yeah, it's very, you think of a lot of the J horror stuff at the time that was dealing with kind of like proto computer stuff, right? Like the
Mm,
concept of viruses and with the ghost in the machine over and over and over again. The fact that they do treat this haunting more like a virus is probably one of the most unique things. Like it shouldn't there should be a part of you that watches that scary scene in the school and thinks, "Ah, you're breaking the rules, you can't do this." But instead you're like, "Oh shit, you go in the house for a minute and wherever you end up in life, this thing is going to get you and it's going to kill you." And it becomes part of like that viral element of the scares.
And I think just on a storytelling perspective, it is a lesson in a way to a lot of filmmakers, because I think it'd be very easy for a lot of mainstream viewers to watch Jew on the Curse and immediately be like, well, of course, I'm just going to watch the American version if I really want to watch a horror film. And I understand that. I mean, the appetite for low budget indie horror is not as prevalent in the mainstream as it is with us critics and people who study horror and things of that nature. But I was very impressed because, number one, I mean, I said the effects thing already. It holds up. To me, it holds up. There's a few CGI scenes where, all right, you got a girl with a missing jaw and her tongue flops out. Does it look great? No. Do I still see horror movies today that look maybe even worse? Yeah. Like the fact that this is 2000, he pulled off that effect versus a 2021 film that does the same thing. I weigh those a little differently. But The storytelling is impressive in the sense that, I mean, a director made his movie. He took his shot. And was it low budget? Did it take a lot? Yes and no. I'm sure it took a tremendous effort to get done on the director's part and the entire crew's part. But when you compare it to a studio production, no, you can't really compare the two. This was down and dirty. This was do it yourself. But what it birthed and what it was able to become, like, it's almost iconic to watch something happen like that. It's almost, it's just how you can see this little seed and watch it grow into the different Hollywood iterations that it has had. And not even, sorry, not Hollywood, like J horror, American Hollywood, everywhere it's been and everywhere it's gone to. It all started with this tiny little film. And that's what this is. This is a tiny little film, a tiny little anthology that was probably shot in way less time than we even would presume it to be. That's just it, like, it's so amazing. Like, honestly, it is just so amazing to watch it. And again, that's because the same creator was involved in so many of the projects that came after you. It is the biggest testament to just going out and shooting your shot. Like, this is the example.
Well, and you talk about iconic, and I think you have to use that word with this film, whether it's low budget or whether it's not been seen or not, because there are shots in this film that have resonated through each iteration of the Grudge. There's the scene where someone's looking out of the window and Toshio is sitting. Toshio, who they believe is alive, is sitting on the couch, and he just sort of opens his mouth and meows. Like, that is in the American remake. That is in the original, the Grudge, the Japanese theatrical release. There's the scene of Kayako pulling herself down the staircase. Like, these are, and then the scene with the jaw. Like, these are iconic scenes that have lasted through various iterations of this series, and it all started here in a very low budget, do it yourself or releasing straight to video type of manner. And I think that's amazing.
So let me ask this then, because this is usually the part on the show where we start to talk about legacy, right? We start to dig into what allows these films, or what might encourage these films to succeed with audiences for the foreseeable future. We've talked about the fact that this is a weird one because if you are of a certain age, probably the first Grudge that you saw, even if you were savvy with J horror, was the 2003, 2002, 2003 Ju-on the Grudge, because that was the one that got a theatrical release. That was the one that got larger distribution. For all intents and purposes, for an entire generation of horror fans, that's probably the first Ju-on film. The fact that this is really the first Ju-on film, and in a lot of ways, based on the way you two are describing it, better than some of the ones that came afterwards, certainly more worth your time. Does it become this academic exercise where you're like, oh, you have to kind of develop the chronology of it, and this came first, and you have to explore the VHS components that would later be able to come into, like, yada yada yada. Is it just one of those things where only people who really care about the historiography of Ju-on franchise are going to be into this, or do you think it becomes this sort of hatchet cut where over time people are like, okay, there's 12, there's 13 Grudge movies, but like The Curse, the American remake, the second, whatever order you want, are people going to be able to sort of pick and choose a la carte and say, there are all these movies, but these are the ones you should care about?
Well, I would say that if you are interested in Ju-on, as in the Japanese movie more so than the American movie, then I would say that this is, if you watch the series from Ju-on the Curse to Curse 2 to The Grudge to The Grudge 2, you would see not only kind of a remake of the ideas introduced in the Curse, but you would also see the storylines, because while The Grudge is in all intents and purposes a reboot slash kind of remake of The Curse, there are aspects of both The Grudge 2, or The Grudge and The Grudge 2, talking Japanese one, that are continuing the story that started, not necessarily remaking it, but actually continuing it. There are scenes in The Grudge and Grudge 2 that reference both The Curse and The Curse 2. And there are scenes all the way going all the way through the series of the Japanese version of The Grudge that pull from this original series. So if you want to see a complete story and you are interested in the Japanese version of The Grudge, then I would say that watching this from The Curse to the end, you will pick up things that are story related, not necessarily a remake, but a story related from that original film. And that's what I think is so interesting the way that the curse, like the idea is that the curse, something happens and then the curse continues from there, and that has been kind of this prevalent idea between all of the Grudge movies. And so the way that you see that this film sort of spirals out from this original film, while keeping almost in some way a same timeline throughout most of the Japanese Grudge, is fascinating to watch, more so than just a historical artifact of 2000. It's actually telling a story that influences the idea of the Grudge being a curse that sort of spirals throughout time.
Yeah, and Monocle, you mentioning academic is, I think, something that I'll hit upon more in the sense that if you are a super fan of The Grudge, and I mean that in the Japanese films, in the American films, in all the iterations, you have to see the curse. I mean, you have to understand where it all came from. I wholeheartedly suggest it because you go in with the disclaimer that, listen, this was the very first one, and this was made for a low budget, as we said 17,000 times. We'll say it again. This is the low budget version of The Grudge. But if you are into everything you've seen so far and you're so obsessed with Kayako and The Grudge itself and the idea of this just entity that cannot move on in certain senses until there is some kind of relief, and everything that spirals from that, you need to see the curse because you need to see where it all started. But if you are outsider, if you dabble in horror, if this is something that the Grudge franchise is kind of just, I saw the American, I liked it enough. It's hard to recommend the curse because it does fall into a more filmmaker's aspect, where I would say it's a filmmaker's film in the sense that any other filmmaker watching The Curse and just talking about it the way we have and using the word iconic and saying, my God, like, you watch what this guy did and how he turned it into all these different ideas and how it became what it became. That's the bigger talking factor. I think there's a lot more value in the academic approach, where it's written about, where it's appreciated by other filmmakers, and where it is discussed amongst the horror faithful, versus it's going to be a hard sell to the mainstream audience. It's going to be a hard
Yeah.
sell to somebody that is not into the indie mindset, where when they go to Walmart and they see the dollar bin, they immediately run away. Like, you have to have a little bit of that, I guess, that like indoctrination in a way. If you went to Blockbuster and you got the $3 movies that were there eventually when they couldn't be rented, you're going to be okay with the curse.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, and I'll back that up just a little bit and say that there has been a lot of really good stuff written, and there continues to be a lot of really good stuff written about sort of that North American Japanese pipeline of horror in the early 2000s, and the way that the two cultures really started to feed off of each other and created sort of a feedback loop where you know American horror films inspired a generation of Japanese filmmakers who then created movies that would inspire a generation of American filmmakers. It's like it's such an interesting thing, and there has been a lot of really good academic stuff written about it. A lot of really good essays, a lot of really good collections of essays about early 21st century horror and Japanese horror in particular. That there whatever the line is where it's something you have to watch because it's of importance to the era in which it was released. I think it's safe to say that Jewel on the Curse easily crosses that hurdle. This is not a movie that you should watch only because you're interested in kind of developing the history of the era. There's a lot to like here, and it's a lot of fun. And especially, and Donato, I think you said this well. If you're an aspiring filmmaker, if you're somebody who is on TikTok right now making really kick-ass, 2-minute short horror films for an audience that started as just your mom and now is like thousands of people, I guarantee you're going to watch something like Jewel on the Curse and be like, "Fuck, I could do that." And you know
Yeah.
what? You probably can, and you probably should.
Shoot your shot.
Shoot your shot. Shoot your shot. All right, gentlemen, that is it. That is this episode of Certified Forgotten. So, Terry, I want to say thank you for being a great guest, for being our first video guest again. I just can't drive home how uncomfortable you've looked this whole time being on camera with us. But for those of our listeners who are really excited by some of the stuff you were talking about, some of the projects you have and are involved in, if they want to learn more about you, where do they go? Where's the best place on social to follow you in the couple of projects that you have?
Well, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Gaily Dreadful. My podcast is Scarred for Life, and it's at Scarred Podcast on Twitter. And we, as Monagle said, we've been interviewing a lot of directors recently. So we have Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead an episode like last month, and we have a couple coming up with Natasha Kermani, the director of Lucky, and we have Anthony Scott Burns, the director of Come True. So we have a couple of those coming up soon in March, and then yeah, my website is www.gailydreadful.com, and that's where you'll find all of my writing for the most part.
Donato.
You can find me, at always, at Donato Bomb on the Twitter, Letterboxd, and Instagram. You can find my reviews on Rotten Tomatoes. You can find everything else. Follow my authory page where it all collects nicely for you, and it'll come out a little newsletter, and it's great. Otherwise, I'll just yell about it on Twitter. And oh yeah, live streams every Friday with Perry Nemiroff. So that's about all I've got, I think.
Yeah, I have to say, I signed up for your newsletter, which I forget every week until I get an email from you on Thursday. And I'm like, oh shit, what did I forget about the site? And then, nope, it's just your authory thing, spitting a bunch of articles at me.
Read my work, Matt. Care.
I support your work. Isn't that enough?
Yes, it is.
Fair enough. As for myself, you can follow the newly Rotten Tomatoes certified Matthew Monagle. Thank you. Oh, thank you.
Don't humor him, Terry.
You can follow me on Twitter, LabSplice, LABSPLICE. You should, if you haven't already, you should go check out certifiedforgotten.com. You know, we are one of many websites that I think are doing some really interesting stuff with horror. We're continuing our mission statement established in this podcast to go dig up the weird stuff. So do go check it out. Do go read it. If your writer pitches something weird, man, odds are we're probably going to say yes. And I believe the only other thing that I have to do I have anything else I need to promote right now? No, that sounds about it. Go sign up for my authory bio so that you'll get emails from me every Thursday and wonder what you did or what I did. That's good too, right?
Also, we have a Patreon. Maybe mention that too.
Oh, we do have a Patreon. You could give us money. And you might think, oh, do Matt and Matt keep that money? No. We immediately turn around and give that money to writers and spend so much of our own money to pay our writers too. It's great. I wouldn't change a goddamn thing. But yes, do sign up for our Patreon. There's a bunch of different tiers. You don't need to get to, if you just want to dabble your foot a little bit in the waters, know that every dollar that you spend is going right back to some of the contributors on the site. And the more money you give us, the more often we can hire Mary Beth McAndrews, which is good for the Scarred for Life podcast too. So it's an incestuous little circle of podcasts and horror sites we got going on right here. It's good for all of us. All right, that is our episode. Terry, thank you again. You gave us 2 movies. We picked this one, but that means you got to come back on and do the other one sometime too. I'm sorry.
Hey, I will be happy to come back and talk about poodle puppets.
Oh God! All right. Oh, deep breath, Matt. You can do this one. This is definitely a Matt movie. It's not going to be zombie ass. All right. Well, we'll have you back on. We'll have you talk about poodle puppets. Donato, that is our episode. Can you please take us off in some fun way?
Hey, remember when we did zombie ass?
Fuck that. I hate this.